My name is Dana Marsh, and I am 34 years old, and I want to tell you about the morning my mother called me sobbing, and how I let the phone ring twice before I answered, and what I said when I picked up. But first, I need to take you back 20 years, because 20 years is where this story actually starts, and without the 20 years, the phone call does not mean what it means. My mother's name is Carol, and she raised three children in a mid-size house in Charlotte, North Carolina, with the specific energy of a woman who had decided early that some of her children were more worth investing in than others. My brother Jalen was the investment. My sister Tasha was the social achievement. I was the one who handled things. Not celebrated, not prioritized. Handled. The one you call when something needs doing, the one you do not call when something good is happening. I understood this by the time I was 10, not because anyone said it directly, because at 10 I was old enough to track patterns, and the pattern was clear. When Jalen made the basketball team, my mother called her friends from the kitchen for 45 minutes. When I won the school writing competition, she said, "That is nice," and asked me to start dinner. When Tasha bat her first boyfriend, my mother sat on the edge of her bed for an hour talking about boys and feelings and growing up. When I had a question about something similar, she told me she was busy and to figure it out. I figured it out. I figured everything out. That became my role so completely that by the time I was in high school, I had stopped expecting anything different. I had built a functioning independence that looked from the outside like maturity and felt from the inside like being alone in a house full of people. My mother's language for me was the difficult one. Not to my face exactly, to everyone else. I heard it at family dinners and church gatherings and overheard phone calls. Dana is so difficult. Dana makes everything hard. Dana has always had an attitude. The attitude she was describing was my refusal to pretend that the way things worked in our family was acceptable. I had stopped pretending at 15. I had learned by then that pretending cost more than honesty and produced the same result, which was nothing. I left Charlotte at 18 for a communications degree at UNC Greensboro. My mother did not attend my graduation. She was at Jalen's travel basketball tournament in Atlanta. She sent a card with $20 in it that said "Congratulations" in her handwriting, and nothing else. I kept the card for 3 years, and then I threw it away, because keeping it was costing me something I needed to stop paying. What I'm going to tell you next is not a revenge story in the way people imagine revenge stories. It is a story about what happens when a pattern runs its full course and produces the consequences that were always going to come from it eventually. The years after college were the years I built my actual life, not a life arranged around my mother's approval because I had given up on that project before I graduated high school. A life built from what I actually valued and what I was actually good at and what made sense to the specific person I was rather than the person my family had decided I should be. I took a job at a mid-size marketing firm in Raleigh 2 months after graduation. I was good at the work from the beginning, not because I was naturally talented in any unusual way, but because I brought to it the specific, focused competence of someone who has been handling things since she was 10, and who has learned that the reliable way to get something done is to simply do it without requiring anyone's encouragement or acknowledgement. I was promoted twice in 3 years. I rented an apartment in a neighborhood I liked and furnished it with things I had chosen myself, and it felt more like home in the first month than my mother's house had felt in 18 years. That is not drama. That is just true. I called home monthly for the first 2 years after graduation because I believed, in the way you believe things about your family when you haven't had enough distance yet to see them clearly, that the relationship was worth maintaining and that monthly calls were how you maintained it. The calls had a consistent structure. My mother talked about Jalen and Tasha for most of the call. She asked me 2 or 3 questions about my life with the slightly distracted quality of someone performing interest. She found a way before the end of most calls to mention something I had done wrong or could be doing better. I thanked her for the call, and I hung up. I reduced to quarterly calls in year 3. My mother did not notice for 2 months. The family dynamics during these years followed their established pattern, with this specific intensification happens when patterns are not examined, and the people inside them simply do more of what they have always done. Jalen's basketball career had not developed the way my mother had invested in it developing, and so the investment shifted to his various business ventures, 3 of them across 5 years, each of which my mother funded at least partially, and each of which ended in the way that ventures end when they are capitalized by someone else's belief rather than the founder's own competence. Tasha got married to a man my mother loved and then divorced him, and my mother spent 2 years processing the divorce as a personal event in her own life, rather than something her daughter was experiencing. I continued to be the difficult one. I had a good job and a stable life and a clear sense of who I was, and none of that made me less difficult in my mother's accounting, because difficult was not about my behavior. It was about my refusal to perform a version of myself designed for her comfort. My mother called me when Jalen's 3rd venture failed, and he needed somewhere to stay. She asked if he could come to Raleigh. I said no. She said I had always been selfish. I said that the apartment was mine and the decision was mine, and that I wished Jalen well. She said she didn't know where she had gone wrong with me. I said goodbye, and I hung up, and I did not call again for 6 months. The karma I am going to describe did not arrive all at once. I want to be clear about that because the word karma suggests a single dramatic moment, and what actually happened was more like a sustained return of consequence across several years that had the specific quality of inevitability rather than surprise. My mother had built her life around 2 people, Jalen and Tasha. She had invested in them financially and emotionally and socially, and she had organized her identity around being their mother in the specific way that produced an identity rather than a relationship. She was the mother of the athletic son and the pretty daughter. She was the woman whose children were going places. She was not, in her own self-presentation, the mother of the difficult one who handled things and required nothing and built her life elsewhere. That identity required Jalen and Tasha to be what she had decided they were. They were not. Jalen, by 32, had cycled through enough failed ventures and borrowed money and broken promises that even my mother's capacity for reframing was being tested. He had moved back to Charlotte twice and out twice, and the second moving out had involved a departure that my mother did not describe to me in detail, but that my cousin mentioned carefully had not been graceful. Jalen had not called my mother in 4 months when she told me this. She said it with the specific, careful tone of a woman who is not ready to admit what it means. Tasha had remarried, which my mother had celebrated, and then had moved to Phoenix with her new husband, which my mother had also celebrated, and then had gradually reduced her contact to Charlotte to holidays and the occasional long weekend, which my mother had not celebrated but had not known how to address, because Tasha was doing what adults do, which is build a life that is primarily theirs, and my mother had never had to contend with that reality from Tasha before. My mother was 61 years old and living in the house in Charlotte, and the 2 people she had organized her life around were not there in the ways she had expected them to be, and the one person she had consistently treated as peripheral was 34 years old with a good career and a stable life in Raleigh, 90 minutes away. I did not know any of this in detail. I had not been calling often enough to track it. What I knew was the surface version, reported to me in the quarterly calls that my mother had started initiating herself in the previous year, that things were quieter than they used to be. I did not know how quiet until the morning she called me sobbing. It was a Tuesday in March, 6:47 in the morning. I was making coffee when my phone showed her name, and I let it ring twice, because 2 rings was how long it took me to decide whether I was in the right state of mind for whatever was coming, and because 2 rings had become a habit, the small pause between seeing her name and answering it that gave me the moment I needed to be present rather than reactive. I answered. She was crying in the specific way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has reached the point where holding it is no longer possible. Not performance crying, real crying, the kind with texture in it. I said, "Mom." She said, "Dana." She said my name the way she had not said it in 20 years, which was like I was the person she was calling rather than the option she had defaulted to. She told me everything, not in a linear way, in the way that people tell things when the telling has been delayed too long and is now coming out in the order that feeling produces, rather than the order that narrative requires. Jalen had not called in 5 months. Tasha called every 2 weeks for 20 minutes, and the calls felt, my mother said, like something Tasha was doing out of obligation. The house felt enormous. She had gone to church on Sunday and sat in the pew where she had sat with my father before he died 8 years ago, and she had come home and sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours because she did not know what else to do. She said, "I do not know who to call." I want to tell you what I felt when she said that, because I think it is the most important part of this story and the part that is hardest to describe accurately. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel satisfied. I did not feel the specific dark pleasure that the difficult version of this story would have me feeling. I felt the specific complicated grief of a woman who has spent her life being told she is not the one worth calling, and who is hearing, 34 years in, that she was always the one worth calling. I said, "You can call me, Mom." She cried harder. She said, "I know I was not always fair to you." She said it with the quality of someone who has been sitting with that sentence for a long time and is finally saying it out loud. Not a full accounting, not the comprehensive reckoning that the situation perhaps deserved, but a real sentence from a real place. I have been sitting with that sentence since March, and I believe she meant it. I said, "I know." I said, "We can talk about that properly when you're ready. Right now, you called because you needed someone, and I picked up, and that's where we start." I drove to Charlotte that Saturday. Not because it erased the 20 years, not because one phone call and one honest sentence was sufficient accounting for a childhood of being treated as peripheral. I drove because my mother was 61 years old and alone in the house where I had grown up, and because I had built something in myself across all the years of figuring things out that was big enough to make that drive without it costing me everything. That is the thing I want you to understand about this part of the story. My ability to show up for her was not produced by her. She had not built it in me. I had built it in spite of her, and because of everything I had learned about what it costs to be unsupported, and what it produces when you decide that cost is not going to define you. I showed up because of who I had become, not because of what she had given me. We sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. We ate the food she had made, which was her language, always had been, the cooking that meant things she could not say directly. She made the meals she made for important occasions when I was a child, and she had not made it for me in 20 years. And I ate it, and it meant what it meant, which was complicated and real, and not something I was going to reduce to a simple statement. We talked, not perfectly, not with the complete honesty that the full situation deserved, because my mother is not built for that kind of honesty, and I had known that my entire life and had made my peace with receiving the version she was capable of, rather than the version I needed. But more honestly than we had talked in 2 decades, and that was something. She said, "I think I put too much of myself into your brother and sister." She said it carefully, in the specific language of a woman who was approaching a truth without quite arriving at it directly. I said, yes. I said it without embellishment because I did not need to embellish it, and because the simple agreement was more powerful than anything I could have added. She said, "You turned out better than I gave you credit for." I said, "I turned out the way I turned out because I had to." She looked at me for a long time when I said that. Then she nodded. She understood what I meant, and she did not try to revise it. I left Charlotte on Sunday afternoon. I hugged her at the door, and she held on for a moment longer than she usually did, and I let her. And that was its own kind of thing. My mother and I talk every week now. Not long calls, 20 minutes, sometimes 30. She asks about my work and my life with the specific attention of someone who has decided to actually listen to the answers rather than perform listening. It is different from the calls we had in 30 years. It is not the relationship I would have chosen if I could have chosen it from the beginning. It is the relationship that became possible after everything that happened. And it is worth something, even if it is not everything. Jalen called my mother in June. She told me about the call with the careful, neutral voice she uses when she does not want to tell me how much it meant because telling me would require acknowledging how much his absence had cost her. I did not make her say it directly. I just said I was glad he called. Tasha visited in August. My mother sent me a photo from the visit. I looked at the photo for a moment and felt nothing complicated about it, which told me something about where I had arrived in relation to my family's dynamics. I had been the difficult one for so long that the simplicity of not being difficult anymore had a specific quality of relief that I was still getting used to. What I want to say to close this is not about my mother. It is about the 20 years before the phone call, the 20 years of figuring things out and building things and being told I was difficult for not pretending that the arrangement was fair. Those years produced me, not the me my mother had decided I should be, the actual me, who drove to Charlotte on a Saturday because she could afford to, who sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours because she had built something strong enough to sit with the complicated truth of her family without it breaking her. My mother treated me like I was less important than I was. That was real, and it had a cost, and I am not going to minimize the cost. But the cost produced a woman who knew how to be present when someone needed her, even when that someone had not been present for her. And that woman is who I am. She is not a consolation prize. She is the whole point. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.